Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this Department of Public Health seminar. Kirsten Lovelock, who's giving the seminar, has been associated with the Otago for 25 years and with this department for 4 years, though she's currently at WorkSafe and she's an honorary fellow here. Kirsten is a medical anthropologist whose research interest is in labour relations, environmental and occupational health in New Zealand. And today she's speaking as an honorary fellow, not on behalf of WorkSafe. She's conducted a range of qualitative and quantitative research and published numerous journal articles, and I'll leave her to give us the name of her seminar. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thanks very much, Heather. Good afternoon. Now, this has actually gone through quite a few version control issues, this presentation today, so bear with me if there are a few hiccups. It's one of those situations where about 2 months ago, I was actually at a conference at Victoria University, and I was sitting up the back and I was thinking, wow, you know, what they're talking about is really, really important, and nobody has said the word class. And then I thought, oh, I've been in the public service for too long. Maybe class is out of fashion. And I actually asked a question of one of the learned people on the panel and said, at the risk of being old-fashioned, are we really talking about class here? And she smirked and said, oh, leave it to me. I want to answer this question. And actually, she was magnificent. She talked about the intensification of work and the sort of issues that she was facing as an employee at the University of Sydney, and agreed that class had somehow apparently gone out of fashion. So today, the heading of the seminar today is The Hard Worker, Class and the Material and Symbolic Significance of Occupational Health Outcomes. And it's a little bit about all of those things, and I'm not sure what it adds up to in terms of a totality. If anything, I actually probably raise more questions than I provide answers to. So I start really from the beginning of my career, but I'm not going to bore you with every detailed account of every study I've ever done. But it's a funny thing that 27 years ago, when I did my first fieldwork in Eastern Southland in Matara, a working class town as we called it back then, many of the themes from that project keep resonating with the work that I have done since. And so I'm returning to Matara in part today, and I'm also going to talk about some more recent research that I've conducted with colleagues at Otago, sometimes solo, and some of it with WorkSafe colleagues. So today, as I just said, it's been prompted by many things. It's well established that socioeconomic factors influence health outcomes, and increasingly understood that while humans may have similar aspirations, life circumstances fashion distinctive dispositions toward their body, health and disease. More recently, researchers have advocated the need to explore fully how health practices are contingent on and mediated by social context, and how identity is shaped by age, socioeconomic status or group, and ethnicity, gender and sexuality. A fuller understanding of the relational aspects of social structures, values, norms and meanings needs to be understood if interventions to reduce inequitable health outcomes are to be effective. So the research, as I've already said, draws on work that I've done over a 30-year period, and I am going to begin with basically the theoretical perspective that I'm employing more recently, but also has been underpinned in many ways with my analysis even 25 years ago. One observation I would like to make is that I do think that there has more recently been less conscious discussion about the causal efficacy of social structures, and specifically how social class underwrites health inequality and can actually undo the effectiveness of interventions that have been developed by well-meaning people. It also seems, as others have observed, that at a time when the causal efficacy of structure has been extended during the period of global neoliberalism, people at the same time have grown less likely to deploy social class as a resource to define themselves and their projects. Yet social class seems to have become more salient objectively in this time, while it has simultaneously become less saliently salient subjectively. So I'm going to make some observations from a number of studies, and I'm blurring it together, so I'm not going to explain what the methodology was for all of them. But in Mataura, it actually involved living in the community for a year. And I did a survey and I also did face-to-face interviews during that time. Some of the observations I'm going to make today almost entirely focus on working men. And men that I have had the privilege to interact with, working in the meat industry and freezing works, and pulp and paper mill, forestry workers and bushmen, injured and diseased farmers, and I've got things around the farmers because, of course, we always talk about farmers and we seldom talk about farm workers. In actual fact, it's my interaction with farm workers that I'm most interested in, and the fact that we refer to everyone as farmers is a very good indication of how we conceptualise class in our rural parts of New Zealand. And finally, it's healthy on the outside, sick on the inside is actually a comment that was made repeatedly to me when I conducted a forestry project nationally in New Zealand and prior to that in Otago. The idea that these fit young men look fit and young on the outside, but actually on the inside, they've got high blood pressure, they've got early onset diabetes, they're heavy smokers, they're heavy drinkers, and other issues which I'll touch on shortly. So the latter projects that I conducted were very much shaped by my interest in health outcomes. I started my career as an industrial anthropologist and became a medical anthropologist 10 years into that career. And I increasingly became familiar with and interested in the work of Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, and in particular Bourdieu's concept of habitus, which has been widely used to understand why people behave as they do, to understand differences between social groups and socialisation processes within socioeconomic strata, and in health to explain class and gendered patterns of bodily care, deportment and management. I'm not going to go into great detail of his theory, but I am going to traverse some of it in the next couple of slides. Briefly, habitus is defined as a system of dispositions. Oops, hang on. I just lost my place, sorry about that. Tasting acquired schemes of perception, thought and action, which the individual develops in response to objective conditions. And objective conditions are social structures, social laws, hierarchies, how we behave and organise ourselves in everyday life. The individual absorbs the objective social structure into cognitive and somatic dispositions. The individual's actions conform to the objective structures and a doxic relationship emerges. It is at once learnt, fundamental, deep-founded, unconscious belief. An individual experiences the relationship with structure as self-evident and natural, thereby reinforcing and reproducing structures in a given field. Habitus is not the same as socialisation, as it encompasses embodiment, where internalised structures, objective conditions, become embodied in a practical and pre-reflexive way, just like muscle memory. When someone throws a ball at you and you are not seeing it coming, you immediately reach out to catch the ball. This is how Bourdieu describes this process. Habitus operates in conjunction with the field, and the field is a setting within which people in social position are located. It can be any social spatial area where people pursue resources. The concepts of field and habitus are Bourdieu's means of addressing what had actually happened in the 70s and 80s, with a preoccupation about how we were going to bridge the divide between the material realities of life and ideology. In a word then, Marxist perceptions or conceptions of how we organised ourselves in social life. He was attempting to bridge that gap and to say, in fact, it is considerably more subtle than that, and we need to actually think about how we can bridge this divide between ideology and materialism and other sorts of dualisms that existed at that time, the subjective from the objective, etc. And he argued that the individual's dispositions provides a middle ground. Habitus and field is a two-way relationship, and both actually must be borne out in terms of method. And this actually sits perfectly with an anthropologist, because what he's effectively saying is not only do we see this in theory and theorise about this, but in actual practice, when you get out there and do your research, you need to be actually looking at the social space and the structures of that field, as well as the subjective experiences of that. And that is really largely what anthropologists do. Class and class distinction. Class fractions teach aesthetic preferences to their young, and these fractions are a combination of social, economic and cultural capital. Differences in cultural capital mark the differences between the classes. Each class develops its own aesthetic criteria. Taste provides a sense of one's place, and one's taste is embodied and drives practices, including health practices. Class distinction and preferences are most marked in the everyday through the food that we consume, the way we present our food, the furniture we choose to buy and arrange in our homes, and the clothing that we wear. It is also present in the way we even deport ourselves, how we walk, how we speak, how we are heard, and how we are seen. When I started my fieldwork in Mataura, it was very clear to me that I had been undergoing a transition from my previous field and habitus. I had started to go a transformation through my education. I had started to speak differently. In fact, one of my professors suggested that if I wanted an academic career, it would be necessary for me to learn to speak differently. Rather lazadoodle, I thought at the time. But nonetheless, interestingly, Bourdieu wasn't fashionable at that stage in academia. But there my professor pointed out exactly what Bourdieu was talking about, taste, about how we present ourselves and how we're read. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in relation to Mataura in a minute. Bourdieu speaks of economic, social and symbolic capital. The latter two enable a more subtle analysis of daily practice. For the purposes of this seminar today, I am going to be talking about symbolic capital, because symbolic capital can become symbolic violence. And that an example of this would say be when a person experiences education and the pedagogical action perpetuates pre-existing power relations. What do I mean by that? If I went into a forestry classroom in a polytechnic on the east coast of North Island and said what I've just said to you for the last 10 minutes, that's what I would be doing. I would be committing symbolic violence. I might be doing it to some of you in the room at the moment, and I apologise. So class position underwrites the production and reproduction and durability of potentially injurious practices among working class men. And we're all aware of the risky practices that men pursue. And in occupational health, we're more than aware of what people will do with a ladder and what's possible to do on the top of a roof. And men excel in this area. They excel in risky behaviours. And risky practice is, in fact, firmly rooted in the material reality of men's lives. Gender manifests itself and takes place, if you like, inside class relations and vice versa. There's always a risk in a presentation of this kind that I'm going to end up presenting stereotypes. I'm really conscious of that, but I'm also conscious that I don't have a great deal of time. So I apologise if that's how it appears, and I'm more than happy to take questions at the end to expand on particular issues. What I'm focusing on today are the reoccurring practices and evidential embodiment of class in New Zealand. That has been evident in all of the research that I have conducted, both in small towns and rural areas and in urban suburbs. It is an experience that I've had working with working people, including women, but today I'm going to focus particularly on working men. And what better place than to start with Mataura? Mataura is a small town in eastern Southland. When I conducted my research there in the mid to late 1980s, it was a town that was a two-industry town. It had a freezing works and a paper mill, and it had a number of itinerant seasonal workers who supplied their labour to the farms in the region, and actually outside of that region as well. As far as health inequalities are concerned, I want to just pause for a moment and say class relations underwrite the associations between socioeconomic group and social status and morbidity and mortality rates reported by social epidemiologists. As a social scientist, we start with class and the other groupings emerge out of class. Also, when we look at work, we look at the jobs that people do rather than the occupational groupings, and we do that for fairly obvious descriptive reasons. And I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about forestry and the different jobs that people do in a forest and how that actually has implications for not only the risks that they face, but also how they symbolically carry themselves and what their actual status is in a working crew. At the time of my fieldwork in the late mid-1980s, about 1986, I moved to Mataura. New Zealand was undergoing a range of significant social and economic reforms. We were seeing the marketisation of the state, the retreat of the welfare state, and the commodification of state services, the sale of state assets. And we saw the commodification starting to occur too in the health domain. In rural New Zealand, there was significant rural restructuring, which actually did impact on farmers, as in people who owned the land, and I'm not denying that, but it also had significant implications for small service towns throughout the country, and in particular small towns like Mataura, that are not actually service towns, but actually doing the productive aspects connected to primary production in New Zealand society. So what happened? Well, in this particular town, the freezing works actually changed ownership 4 times in 13 months. The freezing works in the provinces, in this particular province, 3 closed within the space of 13 months. The paper mill continued to struggle, as it had done since its inception in 1876, a crippled industry that struggled all the time to survive economically and yet provided intergenerational employment for at least 5 generations of Matauraites. So it was still alive when I was there. It was mothballed 20 years ago. So at this time, I would say that the postmodernisation of culture, and when we say that in social sciences, we're actually talking about culture becoming consumption and nothing else. It's about consumption. This definitely was not happening in Mataura. In fact, what was happening in that town was growing fears about becoming unemployed. And in the off-season in that town, 17% of the people were unemployed. The town that I moved to, amidst all of this macro-level change, was perceived in the region as a working-class town. The workers in the town, both women and men, considered themselves to be hard workers, working people who knew how to do hard work. Hard work was a claim, of course, to symbolic power, because in the real sense or material sense, they did not have economic power. It was about dignity, and it was connected to the nature of employment, which until this time had been a life contract. That is, their relationship with their employers, changing multiply at the freezing works and the paper mill, was a contract for life, and it was an intergenerational contract. If you worked well and you worked hard, your children would get a job at the same place, and they would work hard so their children would get one too. And in this period of time, as we all know, we underwent significant reform in terms of employment relations in New Zealand and moved to the idea of casualisation and contracting. But this was still about to happen when I was there. Mataura was defined not just by the work that took place there, but also closely in relation to Gore. Gore is the nearby service town to the rural sector, and from a position of Mataura looking out to Gore, a rather sophisticated place, a place inhabited by people who serviced the rural elite, and therefore through association were closer to that than they were of the like kind down the road in Mataura. In fact, scours from Mataura and all sorts of jokes were well understood in that region and beyond. In fact, I could sing you the song, but I don't have time. Interestingly, I think connected to the work that they did and connected to the way that class is perceived at that particular time in this particular region was also the smells that emanated from the places that they worked. So here again, the sensory experience of driving towards Mataura and smelling the work of the tannery, or depending on the drift of the wind, the smell of the works, the smell of the paper mill in full production meant that it was a smelly town. And smell and smelliness is associated with lower status. It's a sad fact. The freezing works at this time, this is actually a picture of the paper mill, just to throw you completely off, is on the other side of the river from the paper mill. The freezing works was strongly unionised, basically dominated by what I would call a hegemonic masculine culture, a workplace that employed few women In fact, I only started employing women in 1976, and the reason offered by senior management to me was that they didn't have a toilet for females available until then. The women, when I was in the town, worked in areas that were considered to be more suited to feminine skills, and most of the women were working in packaging the products at the end, the tail end of production. Boning and the slaughter board, working on the slaughter board and on the chain, were very much a male domain, and a very well-paid male domain. So well-paid, in fact, that they earned more money than a lecturer did at that time at the University of Otago. And they only worked one season for that salary. This is one of the first things that happened in terms of me challenging the idea of class and the way I'd been taught about class. How could it possibly be that these men were materially better off than educated people in the university sector? And that actually wealth was also interpreted quite negatively in the region. Men who saved the money that they made from the chain or working on the slaughter board and invested it in land were considered to be successful working men. And the other men who chose not to invest for many reasons connected to their habitus were considered to be wasters and to be people who, quote unquote, just pissed it up the wall, a reference to heavy drinking and what they did in their social lives. Interestingly, the chains were segregated by ethnicity. There were 4 chains at this stage, and there were 2 Pākehā chains and 2 Māori chains. The Pākehā men would take instruction from the Māori women who were the supervisors, known as blue caps. And being a blue cap meant that these women could not actually be members of the union. They were considered members of management. And what that effectively meant for those women was they had no representation at all. But they were put in these positions because of ethnic tensions. Management understood that Māori men would respect Māori women, blue caps, and they wouldn't argue with them. And they also understood that Pākehā men wouldn't argue with the Māori women, or they'd have the Māori men to deal with. A very effective way of managing an aggressive male working culture. Social structure and status differences within this town were in part shaped by the cultures of the 2 very different workplaces. And I won't be talking about the mill today, but I would describe that workplace as much more paternalistic, and where men typically describe themselves as being hardworking men with families. That's a bit of a crude separation, but I'm not going to dwell on that because I don't have time. And as I've said already, it was also shaped by how the town was perceived internally and externally. Judgments about taste and deportment, anticipated futures, and as I said before, the sensory triggers of production and judgment. While I did the fieldwork in Mataura, I also worked as a relieving teacher in the high school in Gore that the teenage children attended. And I did this for 6 months. And it was a really interesting experience. I knew immediately who the children were from Mataura, not because I knew them personally, but because they were absolutely identifiable as a social group. They hung together, they sat together in class, they hung out at breaks together, and actually, probably as importantly, they were treated very differently by the teachers. They were treated as people where their future had already been told. And Bourdieu, of course, has done a lot of work in the area, or did a lot of work in the area of education, and it's really very insightful work, and it has application here in New Zealand. Those students also made it very clear to me how I fitted in. I was weird, I was short, I was strict for a girl, and I had pointed red shoes. It made me very odd. And in the town as well, people pointed out to me how it was that I didn't really fit into the field or the habitus, but at the same time tried to include me. So many women took me to one side and explained to me that I was wasting my time getting an education. What I really needed to do was get a man. And there were a lot on offer in Mataura, but that didn't actually happen. In addition to romantic advice, I was given advice about how I should actually dress in order to get that man. And I was also pointed to the shelves in the local library, to the Mills and Boon literature, where actually, again, that is about taste. And the consumption of this pulp fiction was so great in this town that you actually had to pay to loan the Mills and Boon books. 50 cents a copy, I think it was. But if you live there long enough, you can understand why that fiction is popular. Because in that fiction, they address very real material realities for women, and very much women of this class. And the beautiful thing is that they provide a romantic solution to all of their material woes. So to use an old-fashioned Marxist term, it's the opiate of women in working class communities. So there are economic circumstances obviously connected to class, but it's not solely about economics. And I've already touched on that with men working on the chain. One of the things that has come through time and time again in my work with working men is that a hard-working man is a man that denies his weakness or his vulnerability, desires to be perceived as strong and robust and physically fit, and is reluctant to seek help. And this is not just medical help, but actually all help. They demonstrate emotional and physical control as they can and as often as they can. There's actually quite a large body of work that's been conducted internationally, and there is some here in New Zealand as well, that's looked into the issues surrounding this kind of masculinity. And it's been explained as a masculinity that is attached to marginality. In fact, the more extreme a masculine demonstration of power and control or hegemonic aspects of masculinity, being tough, being rough, knowing how to smack someone's head in, get up and walk away, work hard, be sick, keep working, all of those extreme or hyper-masculine demonstrations have been argued, it has been argued by a number of researchers, are an outcome of a class politic. It is actually their form of resistance. So they know that they are marginal, they know that they're at the bottom of the heap in terms of the male order of things and in terms of class, and so they appeal to the hegemonic masculine identity to gain some strength and some dignity and to resist. And I actually think there's a lot of truth in that. In my fieldwork experiences there and elsewhere in New Zealand, I've encountered this more commonly outside of the workplace and more commonly in social life, and that is where hypermasculinity is demonstrated at the party with the heavy drinking and the bravado and often the bullshit stories. And that space is actually a very, very dangerous space for a woman to inhabit, only if she challenges it. To challenge hypermasculine performance by marginal men is a very, very dangerous space to be in. And I saw that time and time again in Mataura at parties you'd rather not be at, actually. So this dangerous aspect to masculinity, the hyper-masculine behaviour that you sometimes see in workplaces and amongst working crew are about marginality, arguably. Class and masculinity and relationships to the body. The relationship to the body in working class towns and amongst working class men, I would argue, is instrumental, where the body is just a means and an end. It's the dominant form of embodiment. It's linked to their labour, to their community lives, to their physical and social field. Hardworking men, as I've said already, keep working when they're sick, when they're injured, when they're sad, or when they're angry, because they don't want to be perceived as wusses or girls' blouses. There's also, however, a fear of unemployment in these communities, and that continues even to this day. Losing a job, being sick or being absent make these men incredibly vulnerable because they fear that they'll be replaced. These hardworking men, early in my career, were very much unionised men, not the case anymore. They were very aware of class inequity, and they were also very militant in the last years of unionism of this kind in New Zealand. The union empowered them, and it was symbolically one body. It was a body outside of their own body that they could actually draw strength from. And if you like, that illustration there is exactly that. It is the ability to have a strong hand through collective bodily engagement and connection. Arguably, that has gone. And now when I talk about forestry, we'll be able to see how it's gone and what the implications of that are. So what happens to working men when their opportunity to labour or work hard is in jeopardy or taken away, where mechanisation does not provide enhanced bodily power, but instead brings about mental strain, We've got shifting fields and we've got shifting habitus, but we don't necessarily have a shifting working men population that is able to actually deal with those shifts. So as I said, I'm going to move on now and consider forestry and bushmen, and this will be drawing on 2 studies, and I'm just merging them together for the sake of timeliness. Both of these studies were conducted in the current neoliberal environment where we have realised marketisation of services, where we do have a culture of consumption, and where the individual has, in fact, effectively replaced the collective, and the exercise of choice to enhance people's personal prospects and improve their health outcomes is to the fore. There has been extensive documentation by epidemiologists and social scientists of the extent of health inequalities in economically advanced societies, where socially and materially deprived social groups die younger and suffer from major diseases more than affluent groups. Differences for men and women in New Zealand, absolute differences in life expectancy between high and low income groups have been estimated at 6.5 years for males and 4.7 years for females. Differences for Māori versus non-Māori are even more marked. Gender and ethnicity and class have had a turbulent union in terms of theory in the social sciences, and it's no less turbulent in reality in workplaces. What comes first has been the biggest argument. Isn't ethnicity more important than class? Isn't gender inequality more important than class? And I would argue that it's a waste of time to try and argue that point. In actual fact, class is central to experiences of men and women and people of different ethnicity. So in New Zealand, Māori workers are disproportionately represented in jobs that are deemed low skill. They have poor remuneration, and they're amongst the greater number of the unemployed. The position of Māori in the labour market is an outcome of both structural and institutional racism. Current worker exposure data demonstrates racial inequalities in both physical and psychological exposures in the workplace environment. Even when Māori are in the same occupational grouping, they are much more likely to have greater exposure to all occupational exposures, physical exposures, chemical exposures, biological exposures, ergonomic exposures, and psychosocial exposures than are non-Māori. Māori are more likely to be employed in jobs where there is high demand and low control, and where high effort is met with low reward. And these are significant psychosocial stresses. Lower employment positions are linked to greater stress, and when work-related stress is combined with other life stresses associated with low income, poor housing, limited employment opportunities, it is likely that this contributes to poor health outcomes and health inequalities. The work that we conducted in forestry, initially it was work that I did at Otago in the South Island, was precisely because of this. And the work that was subsequently conducted in the North Island focused on areas or provinces where it is a very dominant means of employment amongst Māori men. So in Northland and on the east coast of the North Island. I want to talk about that research briefly and the experience of conducting that research. I researched this with a colleague, Dr. Houghton, and we travelled throughout the country interviewing forestry crews. Many of the men in these crews had said that no one had ever come to see them before on their work sites, and certainly nobody had ever demonstrated any interest in understanding what their working lives were like. Our reception was astonishing. I couldn't believe how open they were. I thought, in fact, that they would be quite closed off. Crews are quite tight. Māori men are not known to want to divulge their innermost thoughts to a complete stranger arriving from a city. But in actual fact, it was quite the opposite. They were very sharing and very giving, and I would call the focus groups that we conducted as probably a little bit of a formal title to actually what was a riot of conversation, and one that was punctuated by a great deal of humour. It would go down really in terms of a fieldwork experience as the most enjoyable research experience I've ever had. And when we finished the project, we went back to every site and we told them about our findings. And again, they said, not only has nobody ever asked us about what we think and what we feel, But you've even come back to tell us what the other guys said down on the East Coast and down in the South Island. So I suppose that's a bit of a salutary lesson for researchers, and it's definitely a lesson for the state as well, because quite often you don't go back because things change and you can't. So what do we find amongst those men? Well, for a start, forestry workers do different jobs, and they don't like being lumped into one category as a forestry worker. As not surprisingly, within a crew, a non-mechanised crew, for example, you would have many men working on the skid with their chainsaws, manually chopping up the logs and actually grading them for the market. It's actually quite a skilled job to do. They do it by sight and by feel and by size, but they do the grading using different colours, and then the people who do the loading know how to load them into different classes of wood for the export market. If you're in one of these crews, there will be someone probably working on a hauler on very steep slopes, hauling logs up steep valleys to a point where they can be collected by another worker that will take the logs to the skid and where they'll be dealt with by the people with the chainsaws. People operating the haulers in nearly all of the crews that were largely unmechanised were older men, some of them as old as 70. And the reason for this is there's a shortage of labour in some areas and a shortage of experience. And older men aren't fit enough to do the other work. And so the best place to put them is in a place like a hauler. So down below the slopes, there are chains that run down, and those chains are actually connected to the logs that are dragged up by the hauler. And the people that connect the chains to those logs are called breaker-outers. And breaker-outers, thanks to WorkSafe, now have to run 40 metres either side every time they chain up a log, so they don't get hit by the logs, because it's the most dangerous job in a forestry site, and that's where we see most fatalities. But from these men's perspective, only some wally down in a state government department could come up with a law like that. And to quote one guy, I'd like to see them get their white asses up here and work on this slope all day and find out what 40 metres actually means. And it's true. Those men who do breaking out effectively run a marathon every day. Healthy on the outside, but sick on the inside, according to their foreman. So breaker-outers are, if you like, also quite high status, because the greater the danger, the higher the status. The greater the risk, the bigger the man. And there are gradients, of course, across that. Some people are recognised for their skill in terms of grading and other things. And this is why social scientists focus on jobs, not occupation, not occupational category, because it can not only tell you what the risks are, but it can also tell you about the social group and how it actually works. So people who do things wrong in the current working environment are taken off positions, and that is enormously disruptive to well-established hierarchies and status differences. To be punished as a senior breaker-outer is a massive insult. There's all sorts of tensions with health and safety as it plays out in these fields and habitats. What else did we find out about these men? They were in the forest because they hated education. Education was a negative experience for them. They looked back at it with hurt. They had been insulted, experienced, in Bourdieuian terms, significant symbolic violence. And any kind of intervention that had been used with forestry workers in terms of upskilling or training to meet new regulatory requirements involved taking them into a classroom. Quite astonishing, really. And a number of people who had the misfortune of teaching these classes were well aware of the fact that it was a complete and utter waste of time and a bad thing to be doing to these men. Some of these providers actually go out to the forest now and actually instruct on site. So this last part of my presentation is going to consider an intervention that was developed by the Maruiti team at WorkSafe. And it's an intervention that was a kaupapa intervention, and it's one that I actually evaluated. I'm going to describe it very briefly, and then I'm going to raise some questions at the end and hopefully stop in time for questions from the floor. It was a health promotion intervention, effectively. It wasn't actually called that, but that's effectively what it was. It involved 4 wānanga. It was conducted in Ruatoria, in the marae in Ruatoria, and it involved 4 different crews and their contractors and the corporate forest owners coming together at those wānanga to discuss occupational health issues for workers. So there were quite a few barriers that this team were actually trying to overcome. One, they were trying to overcome the intense hatred for anybody that works for a government department. Being let down, in their view, by the state on multiple occasions, having public servants turn up and make promises that they never deliver on, intervening to improve and make their lives better in ways that were completely incomprehensible. And those are quite significant barriers, really, to have to overcome. And to the credit of the Marawiti team, they engaged with this community for a period of 12 months before they even did anything in that area. The problem with that is that that's a very intensive engagement period. It's a significant resource to engage for that period of time. It's one of the main reasons why the intervention was successful in a number of ways. I was lucky to attend some of those engagement encounters from the outset, so it's an evaluation come true in the sense that you're there from the beginning. And I attended the wānangas and made observations and then ultimately interviewed the workers and the corporate forest owners and the contractors. The marae was chosen quite deliberately because it was a site of symbolic power for a group of people or workers who have basically been disempowered. Any of you that know Ruatoria will know that it's surrounded by an immense rural hinterland. There are no other opportunities for employment in that area other than the forest. We've had the highest fatality rate in that area in forestry for a number of years and the highest number of serious harm. Most of the people that are hurt in that area are Ngāti Porou, and when someone dies, it has an enormous impact. It actually doesn't just impact on Ruatoria, it impacts all the way up and down the coast, because in one way or another, they're all related to each other. So it has quite a big span of impact. So the marae was chosen as a place. But sometimes we make assumptions about a place and how meaningful that's going to be. And it turned out that it was reasonably meaningless for the young men. Most of the young men were disenfranchised in terms of Māori culture, did not speak te reo, and actually felt intimidated by being asked to come onto a marae where they might be shamed because of their lack of cultural knowledge. Initially, the team didn't realise this, but they did a massive backtrack when they did, and made a considerable effort to do te reo but with translation, and to act rather than as an educational intervention, as an engagement intervention where the Pākehā contractors were on the journey with them. Very successful and quite cleverly done. When these young men turned up to the wānanga initially, they turned up in their black hoodies with their hoodies up and their wrap-round black glasses firmly in place. They shrunk back at the back of the room, they stood in corners, and they made corners where they didn't exist. By the end of the fourth wānanga, these men had taken their hoods off. They were no longer wearing their glasses. They were standing up and speaking confidently to corporate CEOs. And actually, there was a physical transformation that actually took place over the course of those wānanga. I think we decided in the end that it was because of the integrity and the genuine nature of the engagement of the Marawiti team that that particular intervention was successful. But there are a number of issues actually following on from that. They took whānau from the community out to the forest, and for many of the whānau, that was the first time they had actually ever seen their male partners or fathers working. The women were unanimous in their complete and utter surprise at how hard they actually worked. It's going to make me cry. So most of these men who are sitting there, they live in Ruatoria, these men. They would commute 3 hours to the forest every day. They would work at the forest for 8 hours. And if you're a breaker out, you're running for most of that time. And then they would get in their vans and go back for a 3-hour journey. People marvelled at the fact that, these men never went to the doctor. The question is, how on earth could they possibly go to a doctor? And there was no doctor actually in the town. A very, very proficient rural nurse who was absolutely desperate to capture these men, And she did at the Wānanga and enrolled them all in health service provision. But we're still facing the problem of the fact that they work those kind of hours and they just don't have access or the ability to access health care. She managed to, through that engagement, to diagnose a significant number of those men with high blood pressure, some with significant cardiovascular problems, and other health issues that these men were completely oblivious to. I want to end on a slightly sad note, because what I want to know is, and I don't know how this can ever be, how the change that was achieved in that 2-year window can be sustained in a meaningful way. The Marawiti team attempted to get local community representatives, women and forestry workers involved in the Eastern Wood Council to be somehow involved at the decision-making table. The Eastern Wood Council didn't want them. Now, the other thing is too, what happens if the government department that's actually instigated this undergoes an election round or experiences what is typical in the public sector, a turnover of staff every 2 years, if that long-term relationship is not sustained, because that is actually the absolutely fundamental reason why it was successful, as it was a long-term commitment. So if that long-term commitment doesn't happen, then they're being disappointed in precisely the ways that they outlined when I did the original forestry project. So only structural change, in my view, will actually make a difference to all working people in New Zealand. And so far we haven't been able to actually achieve that. We talk in the public sector of joined up government. I'm not exactly certain what that means. I think in an ideal way it means that we will work together and we will bridge the gaps that happen because of the way that we have decided to divvy up structurally and functionally our various projects. But I have yet to see any evidence that joined up government is actually a reality. Regulating in a societal context where there's an emphasis on the individual effectively means it's individual responsibility for health and safety. While it's important to engage worker participation, and it is demonstrated over and over again in the research evidence that it is absolutely key to improving occupational health outcomes, worker participation in a neoliberal environment is a very different ballgame from worker participation in a highly unionised labour market or where there is some kind of collective protection offered to workers. What I loved about the forestry work was the fact that they felt listened to and that some practices have actually changed. Some contractors, for example, have actually provided chemical toilets so these men don't have to squat in the forest. My concern is how long will it take before they return to the adaptation of economic necessity, are resigned to the inevitable loss of hope for positive change and personal achievement or advancement. And how long will it take before they fall back into the habitus of short-termism that is a characteristic of working men in relation to their health and to continue to move forward with a fatalistic outlook in terms of protecting their own health and well-being? And now I'd like to invite questions from the floor.
Kia ora, Kirsten. That was a really fascinating talk. Thank you. I'm really interested in that engagement period, that 12 months you talked about, getting to know these people.
Sure. The bulk of the credit goes to the Marawiti team, as I say, and it was decided to focus on Ngāti Porou, largely because of, as I've already said, the injury rates and the fatality rates were really high. 3 of the key people in the Marawiti team were Ngāti Porou. I have Ngāti Porou ancestry as well. I think that was crucial. It puts you in a very vulnerable position, though, when you have iwi connections, particularly the 3 in the Marawiti team, and you're also dependent on your organisation to continue support in terms of that engagement. So I would say that those people worked around the clock to make it work. They literally worked at night and in the weekends. A lot of people didn't have phone contact details or couldn't be contacted by computer, so they drove over there in their own vehicles. So the engagement was an engagement that had utter integrity. And that's, all credit to those people. How sustainable that is in the long term, I don't know. I think that being an evaluator, it's really important to be there right at the beginning and to know all of those details and to see them. So that's the major win for me as an evaluator, was actually being part of it right from the beginning. But also, the more you become involved in something, the more vested you become in it, and the more despondent you become when you think it might fall over. Mm.
Okay, I'll ask a question.
Thank you, Hera.
Yes, first of all, I'd just like to make a comment, which is working on gun policy and looking at what's being said. It's interesting how much anger there is amongst the men who talk about gun control, and I'm interested in how much anger you think there is amongst these men in terms of, well, you talked about them feeling being let down, but so does that translate into anger, and is it in your mind a destructive anger for themselves? And then I'd like to ask a completely different question, which is Helen Kelly, before she died, and sorry, my mind's gone blank on which is English and which is New Zealand, the Combined Trade Unions, Council of Trade Unions, thank you, had put a lot of energy into talking about forestry deaths. And so would you say that perhaps some of the energy that came into this project was coming from that residual unionism, residual union strength in New Zealand?
It's about 2 questions there, maybe 3. I'll start with the latter one because that's foremost in my mind, the recency effect. I think that the CTU and Helen Kelly provided or gave a media presence to the issues in forestry that people in the forestry industry were well aware of. I would say yes, there was a unionised effort, but forestry is actually a really quite dramatically under-unionised workforce. And the workers that I spoke with, particularly in Northland, were quite cynical about CTU involvement and saw it as a means of trying to recruit them. So there's a very strange tension there because they've never actually been a member of that collective. They are suspicious of collective endeavours. The gun situation would probably fit more with not so much this intervention, but research that we did in forestry more generally. Many of the men that work in forestry supplement their household incomes by hunting. And bushmen in forestry are men who know the ways of the bush, and bushmen are old men. Bushmen are people who went through the New Zealand Forest Service for their training, and that training offered them a number of pathways that they could take. They could go to university ultimately if they wanted to, but they could be track builders or they could be rangers, they could be real bushmen. I do know from very early research that I did in forestry that bushmen were also the men that taught the young men a lesson. And in terms of crews and how they worked together, violence was actually a key component of establishing hierarchy and demonstrating status. So young men went into the forest in fear of their lives most days, because if they looked at an older guy in slightly the wrong way, they'd be taken around the back of the van and given a hiding. That was not unusual, and the Forest Service were well aware of those issues. It was only when health and safety became more of an issue in the 80s that they started to address the violence within crews and that kind of behaviour. So gun culture is part of it, but it's more, I think, connected to supplementing household income or food, providing. I don't know if I really answered you there. I don't know if you said they're angry. Are they angry? Depends how we read it, doesn't it? I think if you looked at most of the literature that looks at working men, anger is actually represented through getting absolutely drunk or absolutely high or both and driving as fast as you possibly can or having a fight. So those are sort of the main vents to erase being dispossessed.
Hi, that was a really fascinating talk, so thanks for that. My question is about, you asked about kind of sustaining engagement, especially with government departments where staff might turn over every couple of years. Do you see that as the same kind of dynamic with the casualisation of work? So when you talk about structural change, is that at kind of all levels, government right through to workers, or are you kind of focusing that on the workers? Does that make sense?
No, that's a good question. It's a really hard one, and I don't know the answer to it. I suspect that it's change everywhere. I think casualisation is an issue for working men and women, and it's an issue actually for a lot of young people, irrespective of the habitus that they may occupy increasingly. I think at the public sector level, there have been significant changes in the last 10 to 15 years where they've moved away from expert knowledge toward generalist knowledge, where generalists manage and control the work programs of those departments. And one of the outcomes, that's probably an unintended outcome of generalism, is that people get bored after 2 years and they move on. Now, when that was initially introduced, actually in the mid-80s, the State Services Commission, head of the State Services Commission explained it in terms of this is a wonderful opportunity for young people to get lots of different experience and to have a varied and interesting career. He's still alive. I'd quite like to talk to him some days. What it really meant is that you just have this massive churn and you don't have a solid knowledge base happening in the institutions in the way that you used to. There may well have been problems with the old way, and I don't doubt that. I mean, I think, Roger Hall's conveyed that fairly effectively. But basically, this churn means that you don't. And what also happens is that there's a hollowing out that happens constantly because expert knowledge is contracting out. You're contracting out for evidence. They provide the evidence. It might be read, it might not. It might be digested, it might not. And that it might have been, and then they move on. And so the knowledge is accumulating out there in the private sector, and we have a hollowed out state, which is hugely important in terms of trying to protect our democracy. So all of those things that you raised, all of those things have to be addressed if there's ever going to be any real change. So it's a mammoth task. Yeah. We used to call it a revolution. I wanted to call my thesis, there ain't going to be no revolution. I was joking there, don't tell anyone I said that. It's not representing anybody.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. It's great to have someone come in and talk to us about class and theory and apply it to our New Zealand workforce and our New Zealand men. And can we all thank Kirsten?